So tell me, how much do you know about HIV and AIDS? Are you all fully informed, fully aware? Yeah. Okay, so let's do a little bit of exploration together. What does HIV stand for? Human immunodeficiency virus. What does AIDS stand for? Thank you, well done. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. What's the difference between HIV and AIDS? Yeah. HIV is the virus that gets into the bloodstream and will slowly start to destroy your immune system. When your immune system is so compromised that it allows some other infection to come into your body that normally your immune system would resist, that's when you get an AIDS-defining illness. Everybody who has HIV won't necessarily automatically progress on to having an AIDS-defining illness. Nobody dies from AIDS because AIDS is a syndrome. If people do die, they die from an AIDS-defining illness. You cannot be tested for AIDS, but you can be tested for HIV. Do you know about the window for testing? Have you heard about this? You're so knowledgeable. Do you want to come up and get this? What's the window for testing? It's actually 3 months. 3 months, so when you're testing for HIV, you're not testing for the virus, but you're testing for the antibodies that your immune system is creating to try and defend the virus from getting in. And it takes 3 weeks for enough 3 months for enough antibodies to be created for them to be detectable. So when somebody is tested for HIV and they get a negative result, that's great. But they do need to be tested again in 3 months' time because they may become infected during that period of time. Particularly you, as the College of Nursing and Midwifery, this is important in terms of the pregnant women that you are testing. Do you know the current situation regarding testing of pregnant women? So it's an opt-out system. Every woman who presents herself at a clinic will be offered the test, which is great, which means that nowadays in the UK there are very, very few mother-to-child transmissions because we're capturing it. If the mother is diagnosed as being HIV positive, she's put onto treatment and the virus will become so suppressed that it won't be transferred onto the unborn child. That can only happen in the first 3 months of pregnancy. It takes 6 months of medication to get to a level where the virus is so suppressed that it won't infect the child. So the mother needs to be diagnosed with HIV early on in pregnancy. Where we are getting women coming from overseas, who are arriving pregnant, who may be more than 3 months pregnant, who haven't been tested or diagnosed before they came into the country, then potentially that's an issue. A woman, a mother-to-be, who is tested early on in her pregnancy and then goes on and becomes infected later on, again is a problem. It's rare, but it happens. So, currently in the UK, these statistics from 2017, Public Health England publishes an annual report on the level, standards, and rates of infection of HIV and AIDS in the United Kingdom. I've taken some information from the 2017 report, and I've also got some information from the 2018 report, which is presented in a different format. So that's why I've got the two different sets of statistics. So you can see that in 2017, just over 101,000 people were living with HIV in the UK. Do you know globally what number of people have been diagnosed with HIV since it was first identified back in 1981? What's the global figure of people? Think of a number. Multiply it by 10, divide by 3, and you end up with 70 million. 70 million people have been diagnosed with HIV across the globe since 1981. How many of those people are still alive? Come on.
25.
I thought you said 20 people. not, not far off, 35 million, so approximately half of the HIV population are still living. And we're really lucky here in the UK in that actually it's a fairly small population that we have compared to the rest of the world. And it's a pretty contained epidemic. 4,363 new infections in 2017, 428 AIDS-related deaths. So we still have people who are dying of AIDS here in the UK, predominantly because either they were diagnosed too late for them to be saved, their AIDS-defining illness was so far progressed that they couldn't be saved, or else they are unable to adhere to the regime of medication. Somebody who is HIV positive on medication needs to take that medication regularly, every day, at the same time, every day, without fail. If they stop taking the medication for a period of time, the body will build up resistance to the medication, and then when they start taking the medication again, it won't have any effect. So they will need to change regimes. People sometimes are unable to adhere to the regime because they have mental health issues, addictions, alcohol, drugs, whatever, means that they are incapable of sticking to that regime. And that's why we get that relatively small number of people who are still dying of AIDS-related illnesses here in the UK. Do you know what ART is? A-R-T? Also sometimes known as HAART, H-A-A-R-T, highly active antiretroviral treatment, which is the medication that people with HIV have to take. Again, here in the UK, we are really lucky that at the moment it is free, it is easily accessible. For somebody living with HIV, the medication can cost, if they are diagnosed late, something like £4,000 a month, between £4,000 and £6,000 a month. So it's not cheap. But out of that number of people living with HIV, a substantial number of people don't know that they have HIV. So I can see you in your minds thinking, well, how do we know that they've got HIV and they don't know they've got HIV? Do you know the answer to that? Shall I give you the answer to that? When anybody has blood taken to be tested for anything, a certain amount of that blood is sent off to the Centre for Infectious Disease Control, and that blood is tested for any kind of infectious disease which might be appearing in the country. It's done anonymously. So that person is just given a number, so they can identify how many new diagnoses there are and so on. Those people diagnosed that way are not told that they've got HIV, because you have to give your authorization to be tested for HIV. This is done anonymously. Why is this a significant number? Why is it important that we know that there are that many? You're going to say?
Because they can still pass it on.
Because they can still pass it on. This is the ticking time bomb. These people haven't been diagnosed. They're not on treatment. They don't know that they are infectious. They could be having unprotected sex and passing it on to other people. We need to capture those people. London is the highest level of infection across the whole country. And certain parts of London, Lambeth, for example, something like 9% of the population in Lambeth are living with HIV. Between 1998 and 2017, you can see that HIV diagnoses peaked between 2004 and 2005 and has steadily dropped and dramatically dropped in the last 2 years. Does anybody know why we've seen that dramatic decrease in new diagnoses in the past 2 years? Thank you. Because of the introduction of PrEP. And what is PrEP?
Pre-exposure prophylaxis. Essentially, HIV medication is taken as a preventative measure to stop the acquiring infection.
Thank you. So this is because of the introduction of PrEP, which is freely available in Wales and Scotland, but not yet freely available here in England because it's still being trialled by NICE. It's supposed to be a 1-year trial ending earlier this year. Supposed to be available to all the different demographics, and when they did the analysis they found out that 98% of the people who are accessing PrEP through NICE were gay. Very few women, very few bisexuals. So they've rolled it out for another year to try and increase and make the population of people accessing PrEP through NICE more diverse. And we wait to see what happens at the end of that trial period. My personal feelings on this is that it's terribly short-sighted. As I've said earlier on, the cost of providing medication for somebody living with HIV between £4,000 and £6,000, the cost of PrEP is something like £100 a month. There's something there about Victorian judgments and so on and so forth. PrEP can still be bought elsewhere, online. There are certain reputable sites where people who want to access PrEP are not on the trial can purchase it that way. So there are lots more people accessing PrEP than just the people who are on the trial. But it does mean that we have seen the numbers of people diagnosed with HIV dropping substantially. Sadly, at the same time, we've also seen the number of people diagnosed with other sexually transmitted infections, chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea, zoom up because of this belief that PrEP will actually protect you from all kinds of sexually transmitted infections, and it doesn't. It only protects you from HIV. You can see along the bottom row the orange colour, which are people who were diagnosed with AIDS at the time of their HIV diagnosis, have remained fairly low, and the number of deaths remained fairly low in comparison to the number of people living with HIV. This is specific to the UK. This is not globally representative. And HIV doesn't discriminate. We have got various different demographic groups, and I've got some statistics that I'll show you in a moment that are affected by HIV. We have got children who were born with HIV who are now growing older. There are two populations that are deemed to be the most at risk of acquiring HIV here in the UK. Do you know what those two populations are? Black African, heterosexual men and women. Thank you. And the other one? No. Not gay or bisexual men. You're absolutely right. Postmenopausal women. So women of a certain age who may be separated, divorced, widowed, finding new relationships, thinking that because they are postmenopausal, they don't need to use any protection because they're not going to become pregnant, but they do become infected. Those are the two key target groups that we need to keep pushing that information out. The rate of infection amongst gay and bisexual men has dropped because they are a more informed population. So, diagnosis by sexual orientation, as you can see, the middle red line is diagnosis amongst women, all of them declining, but the diagnosis amongst women still is fairly substantial. 2017, something like, 1,500 women were diagnosed. Heterosexual men, the least prevalent, but still significant, and at the top, gay and bisexual men. Here in the UK at the moment, I've got another slide which shows this statistic. 52% of the HIV community are gay and bisexual men, which means that 48% are not. But there is still this mythology that it is a gay disease. When it was first labeled back in San Francisco in 1981, it was called Gay-Related Immune Disease, GRID, before they renamed it HIV. But there is still that perception out there in the big wide world that it only affects gay men. That is no longer the case. This is one of the charts that's taken from the Public Health England 2018 statistics. What I wanted to point out to you is, so remember 101,000 in 2017, we're now up to 103,800, of which heterosexuals, 48,600, and gay and bisexual men, 53,400. So gay and bisexual men, just over half the population. If you split down the heterosexuals, as you were saying earlier on, Black and African men, 8,900, men, excluding Black Africans, 10,200, Black African women, 18,500, and women, excluding Black Africans, 11,100. Why is that figure so high? 18,500 Black African women. Why is it so high? Any ideas?
Is there more stigma around testing?
Yes, that's one of the reasons. Any other ideas? Disempowerment. Many Black African women are in communities where the man is the dominant figure, and women don't feel able to be able to say to the man, you need to wear a condom. Religion also plays a part. There have been cases of churches here in London where the minister has said to the congregation, you don't need to use condoms, you shouldn't use condoms, and if you become diagnosed with HIV, you don't need to take the medication, with disastrous consequences. You can see that London has got the highest prevalence. So 39,000 people living with HIV in London, compared with 55,800 across the rest of the country. So as a percentage, it's quite high. Any questions on that chart? I know there's a lot of detail there. Anybody can access the public health information reports from the Public Health England website. You go in and just type HIV, and it comes up with all these reports. Any questions on that? You're a silent bunch, aren't you? So focusing on women, and in particular the age groups, you can see the pink one that we're slowly focusing in on is the 50 to 64-year-olds, and that's the biggest community, growing community of women living with HIV in the UK. This is the danger area, the post-menopausal women, the ones who think, I don't need to bother. Number of women diagnosed by exposure group, so you can see the vast majority are through heterosexual sex, a small number through injecting drug use, and the last one by other exposures. Do you know what the routes of transmission are for HIV? There are 5 routes of transmission. What are they? Blood is one. Go on, say it. It's all right, you're on camera. That's one of them. Semen, yeah? Sorry? Say again? No. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's identify the other 3 and I'll explain to you why saliva isn't one of them. So through birth is through blood. So when the child is born, if there's a contamination of the blood. The other 3, breast milk, thank you. Vaginal fluids and anal fluids. Those are the 5. And it's a question of having a sufficient amount of the virus in any of those fluids, and that fluid having direct access into the other person's bloodstream for them to become infected. The virus only lasts a couple of seconds when it's exposed to oxygen. So your mouth is mostly open, got oxygen coming in and out of it. You've also got enzymes in your mouth which will kill off the virus. So there are no recorded infections from oral sex. No infections from kissing. No infections from hugging. So you can all come and give me a hug afterwards, it's fine. No infections from sitting on the same seat, and so on and so forth. Here in the UK, Norman Fowler introduced needle banks, which have considerably lowered the number of transmission by needle injection compared to other countries. Shared needles are dangerous because the blood can stay in the needle, and because it's not exposed to oxygen, the virus can stay alive in that blood inside needles. Somebody goes and uses the same needle, injects it straight into their bloodstream, and that's how infection happens. But with needle banks here in the UK, the infection rate is very low. So, provenance of women diagnosed with HIV over the past 9-10 years. As you can see, predominantly women from Eastern Africa initially, but more recently overtaken by women here in the UK. Surprised? Part of this is about lack of information. Part of it is about lack of good access to medication. Part of this is about culture, as I've already said. But also, we need to be aware that there is currently a new epidemic that's starting in Eastern Europe, in China, and in Russia, predominantly amongst gay men. Why is that? Shall I tell you? Because in those parts of the world, homosexuality is illegal. So it's all underground. People don't want to go and be tested because then that gives a sign that they're gay and they will be penalized for that. Number of women by age and by different demographic. So the first one, black African women under 35, not so many, but considerably peaks for black African women over the age of 35. That's the biggest one. Non-black women under the age of 35, and a small number infected by drug use, very small number. So when a person is diagnosed, nowadays, they will be told the diagnosis in person, they'll be called into the clinic. Used to be that they would be offered counselling, not so much these days. But the mental health impact of a diagnosis can be traumatic. For many people, they still have that view that HIV is a killer. HIV will ostracize them, cut them off from the rest of society, will have a major impact on the rest of their lives. So whilst HIV itself no longer kills, the stigma does. The suicide rate amongst HIV positive people in the UK is a third higher than the rest of the population because of the stigma which causes mental ill health problems. It's the kind of things that we are seeing: stigma, the psychosocial impact of a diagnosis, leading to depression and other mental ill health conditions, leading to problems with adherence, taking the medication regularly at the right times. It's still on the statute books that deliberate and willful infection of somebody is a criminal act. There are at the moment, I think, about 15 people who are serving prison sentences because of that. One of the things I do as a volunteer is to run courses for newly diagnosed people. And on one course, I had a young woman who, very newly diagnosed, came with her social worker to the course because she was so nervous. She knew it infected her partner had infected her. Partner had since left her with 2 small children, and she wanted to take him to court. It's really difficult to prove who infected you, and going into court and having your whole of your sexual history exposed is not a pleasant experience. This young woman came, the courses last 5 weeks, one evening a week for 5 weeks. This young woman came for 2 weeks. And the second week she came, she told us she was having real problems. She told her 2 best friends that she'd been diagnosed with HIV. She was banned from the pub. her children had to be escorted by police out of the school because other parents got to know and told their children, don't want you associating with her children. Her front door was daubed with graffiti. Sadly, she never came back. I don't know what happened to her. There are certain countries where one cannot travel if one lives with HIV. There are about 17 countries across the world where one cannot travel if you are HIV positive. I used to work for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, so I used to travel the world. One of the places I had to go to was Dubai. I was only allowed to go I was only there for a week, but I was only allowed to go for that week if my employers gave a guarantee that I would be escorted out of the country. And they did. They escorted me onto the plane. Not quite in handcuffs, but it felt like it. We are an aging population. More than 50% of the HIV community in the UK is over 50. Many people, long-term survivors, have been a long time on medication, and the impact of that medication, the long-term impact of that medication, is unknown. But it's starting to have an impact, starting to have an effect. With an aging population, people living with HIV, there are concerns about how they are going to be cared for. If they go into a nursing home, into a care home, do they want everybody in that care home to know that they're living with HIV? Somebody will have to manage their medication. How will the people in the care home react and respond? And taking the medication over that period of time, in addition to the impact that the virus has on your organs, we're now starting to see people with heart, liver, kidney, and bone conditions. People on long-term HIV medication are aging more rapidly than the rest of the population. Yay, we're keeping you alive, but you're getting older more quickly. But there is some good news. It's not all doom and gloom. PEP, so we talked about PrEP. Do you know what PEP is? PEP is post-exposure prophylactic. If you think you've been exposed to the virus, you can go to a clinic, A&E, within 72 hours, maximum 72 hours, and you'll be given a month's treatment. The difficulty is that when you start new HIV treatment, new ARTs, you may experience some side effects. Nausea, diarrhea, headaches, upset tummy, all that kind of stuff. And for some people, it then puts them off continuing that treatment for a month. PrEP, we've already talked about. What does U equals U mean? Undetectable equals untransmittable. So people who are on the treatment where the level of the virus is so reduced that when their blood is taken for the measurement to be made of how much virus they got in the blood, the equipment can't detect the virus. It's undetectable. Doesn't mean they're cured. There is no cure as yet, but it means that the virus is so managed that that person is no longer at risk of infecting anybody else. So it's untransmittable, which is great news.
Is that what happened to Magic Johnson?
I don't know the specifics, but he was diagnosed many. So did everybody hear the question? Is that what happened to Magic Johnson, who is the baseball player out in America who became very open about his HIV diagnosis very early on? I don't know the specifics of his condition, but I would imagine that, given that he's still with us, he's still healthy, and so on and so forth, that he is U equals U. Yeah. And we have achieved the UN target of 90-90-90 here in London. Does anybody know what the 90-90-90 means? Not you, sir, because you know, I know. Let's give somebody else a chance. What does 90-90-90 mean?
Percentage of people who aren't diagnosed with HIV positive.
So 90, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. So the first 90 is 90% of the HIV population have been diagnosed. What's the second 90? 90% of those are on treatment. And what's the last 90?
90% of them are U equals U.
Are undetectable. Thank you. We got there. Well done. 90% diagnosed, 90% on treatment, 90% undetectable. London is one of the first cities in the world to achieve that 90-90-90, which is great. Just need to make sure that other places in the UK, other countries in the world are able to achieve that as well. So somebody who is diagnosed very early on in the infection will be put onto treatment straight away, which is relatively new. It used to be that you weren't put onto treatment until your blood levels got to a certain indicator point, but now everybody's put on treatment because it's easier to manage and it's less expensive, and can expect to live a normal life expectancy. Probably, actually, better life expectancy than people who are not HIV positive because they are so closely monitored. And any abnormalities are detected early and dealt with. As I say, U equals U, people on effective treatment cannot pass on the virus. UN targets that 20-20-20, if we are able to reach it across the globe, means that by 2030, we will have avoided nearly 28 million new HIV infections. 28 million people saved from having to live a life full of HIV. So, a few key points. UK has a relatively small HIV epidemic compared to many other parts of the world. The epidemic concentrated among certain key populations: men who have sex with men, black African, heterosexual population. Made significant progress in the 1990s, so that means that 87% of people living with HIV in the UK are undetectable, virally suppressed. However, late diagnosis remains a challenge. Still, 43% of people diagnosed with HIV, and that figure has unchanged for many years, are late diagnoses, which means that they're at a stage where they have got an AIDS-defining illness. This is because people don't test regularly. What prevents people from testing?
Poor sexual health education.
Absolutely, yeah. Stigma.
Fear.
Fear, all of that kind of stuff. And yet, if you are diagnosed early on treatment, long and healthy lifespan. It's a difficult thin grey line to cross between saying it's fine, you pop a pill a day, which is what the perception that some people have these days, what it means to live with HIV and AIDS. People newly diagnosed, there is one tablet that you can take a day. It may have some side effects, but it's a psychosocial, mental health impact of the diagnosis that is actually much more important. Awareness and knowledge around HIV continues to drop in the UK. Only 45% of the population know how HIV is and isn't transmitted. You're all far too young to have been around when the icebergs and the tombstones floated across television screens and the leaflet came through every letterbox in the land. That campaign of fear, and it was a campaign, deliberately a campaign of fear, actually saved the UK from having a higher epidemic rate, which is great. The bad side is that that's the only information that many people are aware of. Even younger people who weren't around at the time, that's the stuff they know. HIV and AIDS will kill you. Not nowadays, it won't. We need to update that information. In 2010, Norman Fowler, who was the health secretary who introduced the icebergs and the tombstones, commissioned a House of Lords Select Committee to look into the government creating a national campaign of education about HIV and AIDS as opposed to a campaign of fear. That Select Committee put a number of proposals, recommendations to the government, none of which were taken up. So we end up with this kind of thing. These are the statistics. Last World AIDS Day, 1st of December every year. World AIDS Day 2018 was the 30th anniversary of World AIDS Day. I commissioned a national survey, 2,000 of people who were telephoned and asked 5 questions about their level of information, knowledge about HIV and AIDS, and their reaction and response to it. One of the questions they were asked is HIV/AIDS something you personally worry about? And when it was split down into different demographics of age, you can see that the 18 to 24-year-olds, those who potentially are the most sexually active, say, no, I'm not worried. Now, is that they're not worried because they are informed? They're not worried because they think, if I do get it, it's a pill a day. They're not worried because it's never going to happen to me. It's difficult to say. But one of the other questions they were asked, if you discovered a friend had been diagnosed with AIDS, how would this impact your relationship? And they had multiple choice answers between I wouldn't be friends with them anymore, I distance myself from them, it wouldn't affect my relationship at all, it would improve my relationship. You can see the 25 to 34-year-olds, 54% of them would not wish to be friends with that person anymore. 54%. Why? My analysis of that is that this is the generation who didn't experience the icebergs and the tombstones. They're too young for it. But they were the generation who, because of Clause 28, had no sex education in school, so they have had no information at all. And that's the response you end up with. And this is why many people living with HIV in the UK live lives of isolation, live lives of secrecy, live lives where they don't feel able and confident to stand up in front of people and say, yes, I'm living with HIV, deal with it. Because of this. And because of this, having to say things like, I am not dirty, I am not helpless, I am not being punished, I am not a victim, I am not sick, I am not an addict, I am not a whore, I am not dying, I am not a stereotype, I am not guilty, but I am living with HIV. Thank you. Thank you all.